The situation in Gaza is not lost to Moroccans sympathizing with the people there. On Sunday, there was a huge protest in the capital, Rabat, as people demanded urgent humanitarian access to Gaza, highlighting what they call the killings, displacement, and starvation of the Palestinian people. The crowds chanted various slogans, but mainly they had to do with starvation and no normalization of the situation in Gaza. The protests come amid warnings from international aid organizations about deteriorating conditions in Gaza, where many residents are reportedly facing extreme shortages of essential supplies. Let's talk now to national security analyst and intelligence officer specializing in Middle East affairs, Dan Feferman. He is in Tel Aviv. Dan, thanks for joining us on the program today.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thank you.
These assaults by the IDF are coming amid so much suffering already in Gaza. What justification do you think there is for the attacks?
Look, it's not always clear to the outside, and Israeli leaders have to be very careful what information they transmit. But it is clear that, first of all, Hamas has not agreed to the terms for a ceasefire. They've been on the table since the July 6 talks began in Doha in Qatar. And the American mediators and all the mediators have made it clear that Hamas is dragging its legs. All of this suffering, and there clearly is a lot of suffering in Gaza for the civilian population there, could have been ended immediately. Hamas can surrender its arms, can surrender this conflict that it instigated on October 7th. They didn't have to start a conflict. It broke a ceasefire on October 7th that was in place. It launched this vicious attack on Israel. And it chooses time and again to perpetuate the conflict instead of laying down its arms, handing control of Gaza over to Arab forces or to other Palestinian non-Hamas militants, and to end this conflict. And they choose not only to perpetuate the conflict, but they choose to fight in and amongst Gazan civilians and amongst civilian infrastructure, thus perpetuating. And so Israel launched this assault on the Deir al-Balach area, an area that it had previously not invaded, because it is trying to minimize civilian casualties as much as possible. It is a very difficult thing to do in a crowded place such as Gaza, and the population, unfortunately, has to be moved around and around. It's in a very confusing and a very disconcerting way in order to ensure that they are not in the areas of the fighting. Previously, Israeli intelligence had assumed, from what we know from press reports, that the hostages were being held in that area, and so it had also avoided striking those areas lest Hamas either execute the remaining prisoners, as it has in the past. It's executed Israeli hostages, or that the Israeli airstrikes would actually harm the hostages themselves. And so it seems that either the hostages are not being held in that area anymore, or Hamas has regrouped to that area, thus prompting the IDF to need to go after them in those areas.
Right. So Deir al-Balah is one of the safest places considered in Gaza. People have been taken shelter there because of the fighting going on in other parts of Gaza. But they've had to move again on Sunday following that announcement by the IDF, which makes one wonder which places are still considered safe in Gaza right now.
Right, and there's a number of so-called safe zones. Of course, no place is immune. And again, the problem is, and we need to keep reminding, I see the international community is very good at organizing pressure on Israel. It has not once, since Hamas launched and instigated this attack, organized pressure on Hamas. Hamas can end this war immediately. Hamas could have ended this war a year ago. Hamas could have ended this war on October 8th. Hamas, of course, didn't need to start this war. This was an unprovoked war by Hamas. And so Hamas is fighting and hiding and using human shields in order to either shield itself from the Israeli attacks, or to sacrifice, as part of their strategy, Gazan civilians to capture and create. They also create a lot of images of Palestinian suffering. They direct them. Al Jazeera has been absolutely complicit in this, in order to create pressure on Israel, when the most immediate, logical, and simple solution to this entire conflict that, once again, Hamas instigated would be for Hamas to disarm, surrender, and give back the hostages. And so Israel has to keep finding ways to ramp up the military pressure. Since July 6th, Israel has agreed to the Witkoff, the U.S. Envoy to the Middle East, to the Witkoff proposal, and Hamas keeps insisting on terms that are not logical for the losing side of a conflict. Hamas instigated a conflict that it is losing, and it is refusing to accept terms for its surrender, and so that the Gazan people can move on with their lives and rebuild Gaza. And unfortunately, it is the Gazan civilians that are caught here in the middle.
So much destruction going on in Gaza. I'm not sure exactly where those Palestinians hope to take refuge next, but we've seen pictures of them carrying as much as what they have left to seek refuge elsewhere. Let's talk about those hostages now, the Israeli hostages still being held by Hamas. Deir al-Balah was believed to have been, one of the points where these hostages were being held. And then, you have the Israeli Defense Forces attacking the area. What is the belief here, and what is the goal? Is it really to rescue the hostages? Because there is a possibility that if they are being held in Deir al-Balah, then they could be hit by those airstrikes by the Israeli Defense Forces.
Sure. I'll open by saying here on this that we never know what exactly it is that Israeli intelligence knows, and it's a good thing that it's kept out of the public eye. What I'm saying then is based on assumptions, and it's based on previous experience of the last 600 plus days. It has been very difficult to rescue the hostages with military campaigns or intelligence campaigns, because most of them, from what we know, are being held under heavily secured and booby-trapped tunnels. In the last case, when 6 hostages were found in the Rafah area, when Israeli forces were within a kilometer of them, they were executed before the Israeli forces could arrive. And so it is less realistic that Israel is trying to physically rescue them. What we think is happening is either the hostages were moved out of the Deir al-Balah area, or the IDF senses that it needs to ramp up the military pressure on Hamas as it goes into new areas. And Deir al-Balah is an area that the IDF has not really operated before. It flushes out militants, it flushes out Hamas terrorists, it kills or arrests a lot of them, it gathers new intelligence, and most importantly, it is destroying critical military infrastructure, such as tunnels, such as rocket launchers, such as arms stores, such as communications equipment that allow Hamas to continue this protracted guerrilla and terror campaign that it is conducting on Israel. And the goal is to ramp up enough pressure on Hamas, on the remaining leadership, on the remaining militants, for them to either surrender or to neutralize them as much as possible, so that they come to the negotiating table in Doha, in Qatar, and they accept the realistic demands being put on them by the international community, backed by the United States, by the Arab countries, who are all telling Hamas the same thing. This is a war you shouldn't have started. This is a war that you lost. It's time you accept Israel's reasonable demands and end this conflict for the sake of the hostages and for the sake of Gaza's civilians, who once again are unfortunately caught in the middle due to the intransigence of the Hamas terrorist group.
Dan, why do you think Hamas is holding back? Why do you think it's refusing to agree to these demands by the Israeli government and by all these other interested parties who want to see peace in Gaza and who want to see peace in the Middle East?
Sure. Well, first of all, it needs to be made very clear. Hamas does not want to see peace in Gaza, and Hamas does not want to see peace in the Middle East. Hamas is a jihadist terrorist organization beholden to the Muslim Brotherhood, beholden to Iran and its destructive ideology, and is the last entity that cares anything about the Palestinian civilians. It not only massacred 1,200 Israeli civilians on October 7th, it has been massacring and abusing and torturing Palestinian civilians for decades. The former Hamas leader, Yahya Sinwar, received his nickname, the Butcher, not because of anything he did to Israel, but because of his abuse and mutilation and despotism over Gazan civilians. Hamas does not seek to see peace, and they understand that if they accept these reasonable demands by the United States, by Israel, by Qatar, by Egypt, by the entire international community, it spells the end of the Hamas leadership. And so they have said in their own words, in Arabic, time and again, they will sacrifice every last Palestinian civilian. They've already sacrificed the infrastructure. They will sacrifice every last Palestinian civilian in order to continue waging this senseless war on Israel in order to ensure its destruction. They do not care about the Gazan civilians. They do not seek peace. They seek war for the sake of war and destruction. And this is an unfortunate incident. That's why they're not able to accept the terms, because the terms would essentially mean their defeat. And they want to come out of this in the same position that they were on October 6th of 2023, with them being in power in the Gaza Strip. If what they wanted was to be in power in the Gaza Strip, they didn't have to launch this deadly and brutal and horrendous attack on Israel, and of course elicit and draw Israel's response. They knew exactly what would happen, and they hoped the region would join in an all-out war on Israel, which it did for a short time. They thought that they would be able to poison international public opinion by manipulating the United Nations and by manipulating people in the streets of different Western capitals, which they are doing quite effectively, and be able to come to power to launch another October 7th on Israel again and again. And they've said this very clearly in their own words, which is that's why they're not ending this war.
Well, bearing that in mind, Dan, do you think that the attacks on civilians at the UN aid convoys was possibly Hamas attacking its own people, the Palestinians who had come to receive aid, people impoverished by the war, because there are accusations against the IDF that it did carry out those attacks against those 76 innocent people, but the Israeli government says the IDF was attacking militants in the area. They had seen some interesting elements in the area, and those were the targets of those attacks. So do you think that Hamas was possibly also behind those attacks, especially with the reports becoming more frequent now about attacks near UN aid convoys?
Yeah, what we know is that, first of all, war is what's called the fog of war. It's chaotic, and it's not clear to understand exactly what's happening in real time if you want to be intellectually honest. What we know to have happened, Israel does not target civilians. In the few instances in which Israel has targeted civilians, it has investigated it. Those were accidents, either technical accidents or intelligence failures. By and large, Israel does not target civilians. That has never been its policy. That has never been its strategy. And so the accusations that Israel does that are simply flat out false. What we do know is that time and again, since the GHF American mechanism has come in to distribute aid to Gazans and to bypass the Hamas basically looting mechanism, which Hamas is already corrupted the UN aid mechanisms, and it loots them, and then it sells that aid back to the Gazans at exorbitant prices. Hamas has made $1 billion in profit off of looting UN aid and then reselling it back to the Gazans. And so what we know is that in multiple instances, Hamas has instigated violence near these aid points. And then either the IDF fires warning shots in the area, or it's very possible that while the IDF is trying to target Hamas civilians who purposefully hide among Gazan civilians, that civilians are harmed in the process. I don't know to tell you for sure. These things need to be investigated very clearly. The one thing that is for sure here is that Israel does not purposefully target civilians, and that Hamas has utilized these aid distribution points in order to shoot at Gazans, in order to instigate chaos, in order to elicit some kind of fire, either from the Israeli forces near the area or possibly from some of the contractors in the area, in order to delegitimize them in the eyes of the international media.
I'm sure that Israeli media should be very interested in what's been going on in Gaza. I know that they should be reporting on that. How do Israelis feel about these fresh attacks on Deir al-Balah, one of the safest zones in Gaza?
Yeah, Israeli media, of course, has been covering this extremely closely, and obviously from an Israeli perspective. One of the things on this renewed round of attacks by Israel is that it's not exactly clear to the Israeli public, and the Israeli leadership, both the political and the military leadership, has not exactly articulated to the Israeli public what is the expected outcome on the strategic level of these renewed strikes. And so the Israeli public right now, first of all, there's a lot of pressure from the Hostage Families Forum on the political leadership in order to accept a ceasefire, even end this war, to rescue the surviving 20 hostages. There is a growing sense of exhaustion among the Israeli public. You have reservists, reserve soldiers who have families, who have careers, who have companies, who have been serving 300, 400, 500 days in reserve duty, and they're quite exhausted. You have young conscripts, 18, 19, 20 years old, who have had nothing but war for the last 600 plus days in very difficult and dangerous conditions. And so the Israeli public, on the one hand, has a sense of exhaustion. On the other hand, it's not exactly clear, and it has not been articulated by the political leadership what exactly is the end game here, beyond sort of general kind of slogans or platitudes from the government. And so you have this sense by the public that we don't exactly know what we're doing, and perhaps the excitement by the press or the international community to announce serious progress on the ceasefire talks a couple of weeks ago were premature, and the Israeli public feels that it's in a bit of a limbo state at this point, waiting to see what happens.
And I know that, months ago, the Israeli people did have protests, in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv against the government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, because they feel that he has deviated from the focus, which is to return the remaining hostages back home. Do they still feel that way? Are there still those protests going on in Israel?
Some of the public certainly feels frustration with Netanyahu. You have a lot of elements in Israeli society who from the beginning sensed that some of the considerations excuse me, of the Netanyahu government and of Netanyahu remain staying in power in order to stave off the judicial hearings that are taking place in Tel Aviv. However, large enough parts of the Israeli public still stand behind Prime Minister Netanyahu, still stand behind the government, still stand behind the decision. And of course, the successful strikes on Iran's nuclear program reinstilled a sense of trust that was wearing away in Netanyahu himself as a prime minister and in this current government. We're now at a point where there is some tension between the Haredi, between the ultra-Orthodox parties, and the Likud party, which is Netanyahu's ruling coalition. So it's leaving a bit of instability within the coalition itself. You are still seeing pressure from sizable parts of the public that a deal needs to be reached, in some people's words, at any cost, in order to get the hostages back. And Netanyahu has not made it especially clear to the public exactly what the goals are. I can tell you, just having been in this business of military and intelligence affairs for a couple of decades now, there might very well be moves, political moves, international moves, diplomatic moves that are being cooked up, and they are not being articulated to the public because either Hamas utilizes that intelligence from open sources for its own, in order to protract the conflict, or in order to keep domestic politics out of what are strategic considerations. And that is something that, knowing Netanyahu and how he operates, that something may very well be happening behind the scenes.
Dan, just before you go, does the Prime Minister still consider himself or the Israeli government accountable to the UN and other international bodies, or do they consider these bodies an obstruction to Israel's plans in Gaza?
Yeah, the Israeli public, the Israeli government, I think it's safe to say this is quite a consensus here in Israeli society, does not respect the United Nations, does not trust the United Nations. It sees that it is a body that is absolutely hypocritical when it comes to Israel. Nobody ever claims Israel or its actions are perfect, but when you have dozens and dozens of UN resolutions castigating and criticizing Israel and hyper-focusing on Israel, while serious human rights abusers like Iran, like North Korea, like Sudan, like Yemen, like Syria under Bashar al-Assad, receive combined a tenth of the criticism that Israel does. It is a body that is not taken seriously here. The UN and especially the UN RWA, UNRWA, was seen as one of the key problems that protracted the conflict. There were UNRWA employees that were involved in the October 7th attack. We know that the school curriculum given by these UN institutions has led nothing but radicalization against Israel. And we see the UN here in Israel, and I can say this is almost from end to end on the political spectrum. This is a consensus view that the UN is a place for political theater, that it is far more impacted by blocs such as the 56 nation Muslim bloc of nations that have far more power than Israel ever does, Israel and its allies ever does, and nothing that it does can be taken seriously, and that generally it does more harm than good on the political levels, and that it is not a serious and intellectually or politically honest body, but one manipulated and used for political theater and for political gains against Israel.
Dan Feferman, National Security Analyst and Intelligence Officer specializing in Middle East affairs. It's been a pleasure having you on The World today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much.
We turn to Syria now, as the UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk calls for accountability and justice for the killings and other gross